All right, good morning. All right, our verse for today comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 11. It says, "Or do you not know that the wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who have sex with men, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor slanderers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. And that is what some of you were. But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God." Let's pray. Lord Jesus, we just thank you for time to gather together as your people. Lord, I do pray for Andrew as he tackles this difficult topic, Lord, and let us lead as a community with love towards one another. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Good morning. Big hand for Bob. Yes. So real light stuff today. Nothing crazy. Just kidding. So, as I stand before you this morning, what I carry in my heart is not merely ideas or talking points. It's not quotes or research. This morning, I carry in my heart people. As I preach today, I carry in my heart those who I have walked with as they have wrestled through their own sexuality and faithfulness to Jesus. In compiling this sermon and preparing to preach it, I'm not just simply preaching on ideas and topics. I'm thinking about people that I love dearly, people that I've walked with in painful seasons. I think about friends, family members, and loved ones who are all same-sex attracted and those who identify with the gay community. I also carry with me this morning a profound sense of pain and frustration. To be very clear, it's not with them, but it's in fact with the community I love so much, the church. I think about every bad joke, every cutting comment, every sharp glance, and every moment where those who I loved felt othered by those who claimed to follow Jesus. The same people who told them, "You are welcomed here," made them feel like elephants in the room. And in many ways, especially in this conversation, I'm frustrated because I feel that the church has largely failed in her responsibility to love people well. Too often, the church has played a massive role in pushing gay people away from Jesus. Christians are known for being unkind and hateful towards the gay community. And here's the shocker, because sometimes we are. Sometimes we do model that behavior, and it's a fair critique lobbed against the church. There is no shortage of interviews and sound bites and photos of picket signs where people who claim to follow Jesus behave in such a way and speak in such a way that deeply dishonors and dehumanizes the very people whom God loves. But today, I also carry with me a great hope. I believe that our community here at Zion has the potential to change the rhetoric about followers of Jesus in this community. And in this conversation, that we would display great care, thoughtfulness, and love. I am confident that as we walk through the scriptures together, through challenging questions and underlying frameworks, that we will come to a place of greater understanding and even greater compassion. And lastly, a word to those who identify as gay or as same-sex attracted. First, I want to acknowledge the hurt and pain that you've experienced at the hands of the church. And I want to celebrate your courage and resilience to continue to consider and pursue Jesus, even in spite of those great pains done against you. The second thing I want to say is this, that you matter to God. I cannot reiterate this enough or emphasize this enough, how much you matter to God. I know historically a community like this may have treated you as though you were a problem to solve or an issue to stand against, but hear my words in this: you are a person to be loved, and you are loved fiercely by God. Secondly, you matter to me. I can't speak for every pastor and every leader, but I can speak for myself, and I want to tell you that you matter to me. That if you are gay, I would love to hear your story. I would love to walk with you and help you wrestle through life's most challenging questions. And even if we don't come to the same conclusion, I will always be by your side, for I care for you deeply. And lastly, is that you matter at Zion. Again, I can't speak for other churches and how other communities handle this conversation, but I have been given the authority to speak for this one. And with that authority, I want to say you are invited into the life of this community to ask questions, to be known, and to experience the incredible love of Jesus. This is a controversial and important discussion. I realize that when we talk about the Bible, sexuality, and the same-sex relationships, it's deeply controversial. And there's so much hurt connected to this conversation, and I understand that. And I know that when I announced this series, this is the one that a majority of people came with feedback for that they were nervous about, is what kind of conversation was this going to ultimately lead to. So my hope today is that, and my effort today, is that I'm not cavalier with this conversation, just to offer more noise to an already saturated conversation. But my desire today is to bring forth a sincere, thoughtful, and careful consideration born out of a pastoral desire to lead our community in this area. I want you to know I'm not preaching on this because this is my soapbox to stand on. But as the pastor of this community, I realize that this is an area that we need to lean in and have an honest conversation about, and to do so thoughtfully and carefully and with great compassion. I realize that in a talk like this, there's going to be no way I'm going to be able to encapsulate every question, every angle of this conversation. So all I ask is that you please be gracious with me as I do my best to articulate foundational ideas on this conversation. And next, I just want to give a shout out to a couple of helpful resources in this conversation that helped shape the talk this morning. So the first one is a book called People to be Loved by Preston Sprinkle. This is one of the ones I recommend most highly on this conversation. Again, Love Thy Body by Nancy Pearcey. Another book, Two Views on Homosexuality, the Bible and the Church by a variety of authors with all differing opinions. And lastly, John Tyson's lecture on this. Now, before we move any further, I want to talk about the term homosexual. I will not be using this word to refer to a person who is gay because of the baggage that comes with it. It carries with it some baggage because it has been weaponized against the gay community, as well as it feels clinical and impersonal. And most gay people that I have a relationship with that I know prefer the term gay, which works for both men and women. Now, the term homosexuality is complex because it's a broad term that can mean a bunch of different things. And the word homosexual simply just means one who is attracted to the same sex. But there's a lot of confusion based on how it is used in our vocabulary. Like, what exactly are we talking about? Are we talking about those who are married to the same sex, those who are sleeping with the same sex, those who are merely attracted to the same sex? And so one of the pushbacks against this word specifically, as it pertains to this conversation, is that the word homosexual is not to be found in any of the original texts in the scriptures and was added to most translation in the 1940s. And hear me in this, that is true. The word homosexual is not to be found anywhere in the original text, and is a word relatively new because it was invented in the 1940s. And so the Bible, however, does address same-sex relationships, but homosexual is not a good translation. And I'm not alone in this thinking. There's a ton of scholars who are with me in that. And so I want to say clearly that being attracted to someone is not a sin, but what the Bible categorizes as sin is in the realm of action and in the realm of lust. And all of this to be saying, I won't be using this word to refer to an individual. It may be used sometimes in the clinical literature or in some of the literatures and quotes that I bring up, but just to say as a caveat, I realize that word has a lot of baggage with it. And so in this sermon, I'm going to do my very best to choose my words carefully. Now, one of the things I hear most often from Christians is a phrase like this: the Bible is super clear on this topic. Right? There's people with the bumper stickers that says, like, God said it, I believe it, it is done, kind of a thing, right? But when they get pressed on this issue, like, well, where does the Bible say that? They're kind of, I don't have answers. And when they get pressed a little bit further, maybe they do know a passage or a verse like the one we just read, 1 Corinthians 6. They don't know the nuances and conversations of that. And so what I want to do today is present a kind of fair critique of these passages and kind of respond to those fair critiques, but kind of get us in the weeds a little bit, because it's important that we know what these passages are talking about and where the other side comes from. And so here's what I want to say in this. A part of this conversation, there are those who faithfully love Jesus that disagree with the historical position on this. And it's not that they are not brothers, they are not family, they absolutely are those things. And a lot of what people do is they say, well, they don't take the Bible seriously, and that's foolishness. If you really get into the conversation and the rhetoric around these passages, they care deeply for the Bible, and they care deeply about Jesus. They just disagree with our final conclusion. And so I'm going to do my best to present their side of the story and respond to their questions that they may have. And so we're going to look at a couple different places of the text here this morning, and it's going to require from us great thoughtfulness and nuance. And lastly, as part of my preamble, I know this is a long introduction, I apologize, but it's a big topic. And just to give you guys a fair warning, it's going to be a little bit of a long one today. I've been saying that for weeks, but today's particularly long. So hang in there with me. But lastly, in this conversation, there are a few words to use for different positions. So in a lot of the literature, some of the frameworks used are the ideas of affirming and non-affirming. And I hate that language because I think it already starts off one framework in a negative light, right? Because there's so many things that I want to affirm about my same-sex attracted and my gay friends. And the idea of affirming and non-affirming already kind of puts it in that position of negative. I think better language for this is the framework of progressive and historic. So those who are for same-sex relationships identify themselves as progressive. So I don't think that's a unreasonable label to put on their side of the story. And then historic, I don't mean to load this term, but historic is, I think, an accurate depiction because this is what the church has believed for nearly 2,000 years. And so to say it's historic is not, I don't think, uncharitable. And so I want to be clear before we get started. I hold to the historic view of this conversation. Anyone who has known me for any amount of time has known that I've held this position for a long time. However, what I want to say is I didn't come to this place flippantly, without great consideration, without great thought, without great wrestling in the text, and I hope that you see that as we go through each of these passages. And so in today's conversation, I will not just be presenting the historic view, but I will be responding to the progressives' views pushback on a lot of these passages in some of our conversation today. Now, to frame how we got where we are today in this conversation, I think it's important that we do a little bit of brief history about what got us here to where we are. On the progressive side, a lot of people view this conversation through the lens of injustice. Right? As we begin this conversation, on one side of this are those who view gay relationships primarily through the lens of injustice, meaning for them, this is an issue of justice. The modern gay rights movement really begins in the 1960s following the sexual revolution and the protests of the war in Vietnam. With revolution and rights being on the forefront of people's minds, the gay community realized that America was ready for a reorientation on human sexuality. And so because same-sex relationships were legal almost everywhere in the United States, one of the places the gay community could gather and connect were at gay bars. And one of the most famous ones was the Stonewall Inn in New York City. Now, even though they had a space, it was not always guaranteed protection, as they were periodically raided by police and gay people were arrested. And so on the night of June 28th, 1969, a riot broke out that lasted 6 days in front of the Stonewall Inn in response to police activity. And so this became the moment where people said justice must be done for the gay community, and their efforts were brought to the forefront of the conversation. And this became a catalyst for what would be known as the Gay Liberation Front. In 1973, this group organized the Gay Liberation Front on a campaign on a war on normalcy. And their vision was to bring gay sexuality to bear on heterosexuality in the United States. And this went on for several years and with great pushback, and in its time was largely ineffective. And several years later, the AIDS epidemic brought havoc upon the gay community. Much of the effort and organization from the gay community shifted from cultural concerns and cultural change towards providing care and resources for the AIDS epidemic, because people were dying at a heartbreaking and staggering rate. And in the early part of this epidemic, it was affecting gay men disproportionately. And so the gay community realized if they were to gain traction to get resources and finances, it would be very difficult with the state that the American mind was in. This is why, on February of 1988, leaders of the gay community gathered together in what they called the War Conference in Virginia. It was at this conference that the gay community clarified their strategic strategy into a 4-point agenda for the movement. And after that meeting, 2 leaders began to shift the efforts of that movement from outdated methods to strategic public relations propaganda detailed in their book, After the Ball. Quick question, has anybody ever read After the Ball? I didn't think so. It's $340 on Amazon because it's out of print right now. But yeah, I looked just out of curiosity, and it's like, it doesn't look good. So if you're looking to buy it, save up. But in this 3-pronged strategy, it was essentially this. This is what they came to as a community. They first wanted to desensitize the American people. Secondly, they wanted to jam any dissenting voices. And lastly, they wanted to convert popular opinion. First, desensitize. Here's a quote from the book. "We want a continuous flood of gay-related advertising, presented in the least offensive fashion possible. If straights can't shut off the shower, they may at least eventually get used to being wet. The main thing is to talk about gayness until it becomes until the issue becomes thoroughly tiresome. Seek desensitization and nothing more. If you can get straights to think about homosexuality as just another thing meriting no more than a shrug of the shoulders, then your battle for legal and social rights is virtually won." And this is a quote from them. Now, to be clear, I'm not trying to moralize any of these things. I'm just kind of presenting all of this as historical fact, and you'll see that when I present the opposite side. So the first thing is just to desensitize the American people, make it so much part of the lingo and the conversation that it just becomes normalized. Second, they want to jam any dissent. So Tim Gill, who is a gay activist who amassed a massive fortune as a software programmer, poured all of his fortune into the LGBT community. Nearly $422 million, more than any other person in America. I think I have a thing here. Yep. In the Rolling Stone article, Meet the Mega Donor Behind the LGBTQ Rights Movement, it talks about how Tim Gill turned $500 million to the nation's most powerful force for the LGBTQ rights. In this article, there's an interesting phrase, though, where he says, "We're going into the hardest states of the country," he says, "and we are going to punish the wicked." Any dissent against the full affirmation of same-sex relationships is penalized and excluded from participation in the public square. And this is an example of that, one of many. That a part of their strategy in bringing their concerns to the front is to come against those who oppose them. And notice his language, "We're going to punish the wicked." Now, lastly, is to convert a popular opinion. So one of the leading expert and eyewitnesses of the Stonewall Inn riots was a man by the name of David Carter. And he expressed their collective plan to shift public opinion on gay relationships in a 3-tier approach. First, remove same-sex attraction as a psychological disorder. Second, remove laws against same-sex relationships and establish rights for same-sex relationships. And lastly, remove same-sex relationships as a category of sin. He said, the first 2 have gone remarkably well. The last one, however, has proved very difficult. Again, a quote from After the Ball says this: "Conversion of the Americans' emotions, mind, and will through a planned psychological attack in the form of propaganda fed to the nation via the media. First, you get your foot in the door by being as similar as possible. Then, and only then, when your little difference orientation is finally accepted, can you start dragging in your other peculiarities, one by one. You hammer in the wedge narrow end first. As the saying goes, allow the camel's nose beneath your tent, and his whole body will soon follow." Now, again, not moralizing any of this. This is just kind of how it unfolds, and this is all from their own literature. Now, while this side of the conversation is unfolding, there's another side that is gaining movement as well. And this is the side that primarily views this conversation through the lens of immorality. And this group became known as the moral majority. And their figurehead, a very controversial person, and the man named Jerry Falwell. Here are some comments from him. He said, AIDS is not just God's punishment for homosexuals. It is God's punishment for a society that tolerates homosexuals. Again, Jerry Falwell says, the idea that religion and politics don't mix was invented by the devil to keep Christians from running their own country. And the last quote, if you are not a born-again Christian, you are a failure as a human being. This was the rhetoric going on in that moment. Now, the major success of this in terms of legislation was something called the Defense of Marriage Act, or DOMA. Now, this ensured that at a federal level, marriage would remain between a man and a woman. Now, this act was ironically signed by President Bill Clinton. Yes, the very man who notoriously had an affair with a White House intern in the White House signed the Defense for Marriage Act, right? Do we not see there's a little bit of an issue there? When people think about Christians, research shows this is what people think about Christians. These people, these figureheads who have represented us in the past. When people think about followers of Jesus, the two first things that come to their mind is A, they're anti-gay, and B, they're too political. All of the research and data shows this. Why do people think this? Well, one, it's the way that we've acted towards this community. Historically, the Christian community has acted with disrespect and hostility towards the gay community. When people think about how the Christian community has responded in this area of conversation, the first thing that comes to mind is picket signs that articulate that God hates this community. Think of pastors and preachers and sound bites declaring judgment and condemnation. Secondly, the way that us as followers of Jesus have imposed Christian belief on non-Christians. One of the things I find most interesting is how we have imposed our set of values on individuals who don't follow Jesus. And as we've engaged in this conversation, we've demanded that people adhere to our specific parameters of belief system that they don't believe in. And this is very much putting the cart before the horse. Many people think that merely being same-sex attracted means that you can never belong in the family of God because of our rhetoric in this conversation. To put it simply, we cannot expect people to follow Jesus if they're not following Jesus. And lastly, the way we've responded inconsistently with our sin. The most condemning reality, brothers and sisters, is our own hypocrisy. The same leaders who are championing the cause of defending the sanctity of marriage are the same leaders who make headlines for cheating on their spouses with the secretary, embezzling funds, and are later reported for sexual misconduct and abuse. It seems that we treat sexual sin, and in particular gay relationships, with a particular zeal while ignoring or dismissing the other realities that Jesus has preached on. And so you can see why this is such a contested space. But now, this begs the question, what do the scriptures actually say? Because here's what it comes down to as followers of Jesus. Regardless of what the cultural narrative is, we have to submit ourselves under the lordship of Jesus and under the authority of the scripture. That's fundamentally what it means to be a follower of Jesus, is that you see Jesus as Lord, and he dictates what is right, true, and good in your life. And so regardless of what one side is saying or what the other side is saying, we've got to say, what does the text say? Now, for our conversation, like almost, 80% of my sermons, we begin in Genesis. If Genesis gives us a framework for what it means to be human, it is here where our sexuality finds its roots. Genesis chapter 2, verses 18 through 25. The Lord God said, "It is not good for man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." Then the Lord God formed out of the ground all of the wild animals and all of the birds in the sky, and he brought them to the man to see what he would name them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. So the man gave names to all the livestock, the birds in the sky, and the wild animals. But for Adam, no suitable helper was found. So the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep, and while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and closed up the flesh in its place. The Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. The man said, "This is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She will be called woman, for she was taken out of man." And this is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Adam and his wife were naked, but felt no shame. Now, there's so much to talk about in this passage that we don't have time for today, and a lot of this work I've done previously in the series. But the one phrase I want us to focus on is the phrase suitable helper. There is all sorts of debate about what this word means and what it means for it to be suitable helper. So let's talk about first the word helper, and then we'll talk about suitable. Helper is the Hebrew word azer. Can you say azer? The word azer is used of God by being Israel's help throughout the Old Testament. So this is clearly not about inferiority or weakness. This word is used of God, and so it displays with it a power that helps bring completion. Now, with regard to gay relationships, progressive scholars argue that it was Eve's humanness, not her being female, that made her a suitable to be Adam's azer. And this is true, but I believe it's only part of the equation here. Yes, Eve was a suitable helper because she was a human. But was it only her humanness that qualified her to be a suitable helper? I think her femaleness also plays a role in this conversation, and I'm not alone. And this comes from the word suitable, which in Hebrew is the word kenegdo. Can you say kenegdo? You guys are losing passion with me. Kenegdo, come on. So this is a difficult word to translate in English because it's a compound word. Ke, meaning like or as, and neged, which is opposite or against. So when this word is literally translated, it means as opposite him or like against him. And my translation is same but different, right? That's kind of what this word is getting at here. Preston Sprinkle, a scholar, says this. So here's the relevant point. If it were simply Eve's humanness that made her a helper, then the word like, ke, would have been just fine. The verse would read, I will make a helper like him. But to make the point that Adam needed not just another human, but a different sort of human, a female, God used the word kenegdo. The word potentially conveys both similarity, ke, and dissimilarity, neged. Eve is a human and not an animal, which is why she is like Adam. But she's also a female and not a male, which is why she is different than Adam, or neged. And that's Preston Sprinkle's thoughts on this. So, some of the pushback here is, well, is this prescriptive or descriptive, right? Is it just talking about what Adam and Eve were like in their situation, or is it giving us a template or an example for things in the future? A couple of thoughts on this. First is that anytime marriage and relationships are brought up in the scriptures, they always come back to Genesis. And they always come back to this passage. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife. They always come back to this place, both Jesus and the New Testament authors. So it seems for them that this is prescriptive. It's describing a template, a form for what it means to be human, right? And we would not say of Adam and Eve that them being made in the Imago Dei is simply descriptive. It's just describing them. We would say that's prescriptive for humanity because of how the scripture authors use this all throughout the scriptures. Secondarily, the phrase "for this reason" implies that this transcends Adam and Eve's specific relationship and those specific boundaries and move on towards all marriage. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. That it is both the male and femaleness aspect of this relationship that indicate what it means to live in marriage. So, it seems that this framework is pointing to a telos or purpose for marriage altogether, not just simply Adam and Eve. Now, moving on in the story, we come to the next passage, which is Genesis 19, famously known as Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, this passage has been absolutely weaponized against the gay community and has become synonymous with God's hatred of gay people, right? Think of the very term sodomy, which is derived from Genesis 19 and some have used this to refer to someone who engages in gay sex. Now, I want to be clear. This passage is not about gay relationships. I want to say that again. This passage is not about gay relationships. It's about so much more. First, it's not about consensual sex. It's actually about, and excuse the language here, gang rape. For those of you unfamiliar with the passage, two men visit Lot, and they attract the attention of the men in Sodom. Also, the men from every part of Sodom surround the house and demand that Lot sends his visitors out so they can have sex with them. These men were not pursuing consensual monogamous sex. They were pursuing gang rape. Secondly, when the Old Testament refers to Sodom, homosexuality or gay sex is never mentioned. Ezekiel's understanding of Solomon's judgment was such: as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, your sister Sodom and her daughters never did what you and your daughters have done. Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. Ready? She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned, and they did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty or prideful and did detestable things before me. Of the 5 things listed there, 4 of them are all about the disposition of their heart, and those are all mentioned first. Now, the last phrase, did detestable things before me, there's some different connotations there, but this is a very generic judgment or condemnation. This has no specificity towards the nature of the sin here. It is clear that there's an element to it, that it's sexual in nature, but it's generally, it's a general term, meaning sexual sin of all kinds, which is detestable. So not specific to homosexuality. So it's clear that A, what they're talking about in Sodom is not what we're talking about today because of the nature of it and that it's gang rape but not consensual sex. And secondarily, when the scriptures refer back to Sodom, it's never bringing up homosexuality. It brings up these other things, that they were actually judged because they were arrogant. Think about this. One of the things that he says here is that they didn't care for the poor. That's one of the major condemnations here. Now, in our Christian rhetoric, how much are we making about that issue? How much are we calling our church to care for the poor rather than worrying so much about same-sex relationships? Not that both don't matter, but that we prefer one or the other when the scriptures clearly have a different view. Next, I want to talk about Leviticus. So I know you're hyped. Leviticus is your favorite book. I know, right? Even the most devout, spirit-filled believers struggle through Leviticus, right? It's like, I don't know of anybody who's just like, dude, so much goodness in Leviticus this morning, like God just met me. Now, I have a deep love and appreciation for it, but I understand for sure. There's 2 quotes in this book that bring up this conversation. It's 18:22 and 20:13. It says this: "Do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable." And 20:13 says, "If a man has sexual relationship with a man as one does with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. They're to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads." I know you have so many questions. I will do my best to answer them. Okay, so the 2 questions we have to ask about these 2 passages are this: what exactly is the issue here, and does it still apply to us? Okay? So one of the arguments about this passage, specifically from the progressive side, is that because it's Leviticus, it no longer applies to us, right? That's just weird book about weird laws, like we eat shellfish, so like why are we worried about this conversation? Now, that argument is shallow in its understanding of the book as a whole and how Jesus and the New Testament authors thought about their relationship to this book. Now, Leviticus is a hard book to read because it's primarily about laws. And there's so much to unpack here. But essentially, here are the few ideas that I want to highlight. First, you do not just throw out Leviticus because it's complex. It was Jesus' understanding that he did not come to throw out any of the Old Testament, but he came to rather fulfill it. And part of understanding Leviticus is understanding that there are 3 sets of laws in Leviticus, 3 types of law: ceremonial, civil, and moral. There are ceremonial laws. This has to do with holiness laws about impurity and purity. These were particular to priestly order and the sacrificial system. And because Jesus has fulfilled the sacrificial requirements, they are no longer binding. The second set of rules is civil rules. This pertained to Israel as a theocracy, meaning God led Israel. And so civil law is no longer binding, i.e. punishments for sins or deeds committed. And lastly is that of moral law. And it is these laws the New Testament authors point to and reiterate in their appeals to set the community of Jesus apart. One of Jesus' most famous teachings, love your neighbor as yourself. Guess where that comes from? Leviticus 19, right? It comes very straight from this book. As Paul and Peter are pleading to a community for holiness, where do they plead from? The book of Leviticus. And so it is the New Testament authors and Jesus' understanding, and I believe a faithful interpretation of the text, to not just disregard Leviticus, but to understand it in its context and to hold to the moral law in addition. And so part of understanding it in its context is to realize that Leviticus 18 through 20 is one block of teaching. In the same way the Sermon on the Mount is one block of teaching, Leviticus 18 through 20 is one block of teaching. And in this block of teaching, there are various social issues, and you will see almost every law given to Israel in this passage is still relevant to followers of Jesus. Here are some of them: incest, adultery, child sacrifice, bestiality, theft, taking the Lord's name in vain, oppressing your neighbor, cursing the deaf, showing partiality in a court of law, slander, hating your brother, making your daughter a prostitute, turning to witches or necromancers. This is the example of the things that the Bible, the Leviticus is saying is not behavior fitting for the people of God. And we would still say to that whole list, yes and amen, right? We would all agree that everything on that list is still binding to believers today. So it seems rather clear that this list specifically, and namely same-sex relationships, are still binding. Now, what were the nature of those relationships? And is another part of this issue that we're talking about. The progressive view sees this as having a low view of women, that it's feminizing the passive partner when it says, like you would with a woman, that it's looking down on women. So to treat another man as a woman would to strip him of his male honor. However, I don't think that's an accurate interpretation of this passage. Why? Because the text never says that women are inferior to men. And this is certainly not the biblical ethic all throughout the scriptures, i.e. Genesis 1, that both were made in the Imago Dei and both are equal in value. And so another pushback from this is this is speaking about idolatry or prostitution or victimization. But what's really clear in the language here is there's no pointers to this being about idolatry or prostitution. And in this account, both parties are held accountable. So if this was a victim relationship, only the aggressor would be punished. But here, both parties are held accountable. So, to summarize, it seems rather clear that these prohibitions are still binding, maintain a high view of women, and are associated with any type of victim relationship or worship of other gods. Moving to the New Testament is Paul. Now, before we jump into Paul's text, some of the big pushback from the progressive side is that Jesus and Paul did not have an understanding of like monogamous same-sex relationships in the ancient world. Or if they did, it would have been approved. They say because there was like inappropriate relationships or worship of the gods attached with these relationships, that's why that there seems to be a prohibition against it. I understand that, and I resonate with that. However, I don't think scholarship supports this view. First, their understanding of sexual orientation is not the same as ours. So, in the ancient world, same-sex relationships were largely accepted as long as it adhered to a certain social structure. Preston Spiegel says this: as long as the quote-unquote active partner was a man of higher social standing and the passive partner was one of lower standing, no one would consider the relationship or sex act to be strange. In the ancient world, you did not have a sexual identity as we do today, as in gay or straight, but it was more about gender expression, how masculine or feminine you were. Nancy Pearcey: men in Greco-Roman culture who engaged in male-male sex were not homosexual or bisexual in the modern sense of fixed sexuality and psychological orientation. They simply did not think that there were any moral limits on sexual behavior, with the exception that in Rome, but not in Greece, free-born men and women were off limits. It was considered morally acceptable for a man to have sexual relations with men and youths just as freely as they would women or girls. For the dominant male in ancient Rome, virtually anyone was fair game without regard to sex or age. To put this simply, the ancient world was the wild, wild west when it came to sexuality. There was like no holds barred. The only thing was like social strata. It's like the more powerful person had to be in a relationship with the least powerful person. But other than that, no batted eyes, no nothing. Secondarily, there are plenty of examples in the time of Jesus and in the life of Paul of same-sex pure relationships in the ancient world. Plutarch, in his piece Dialogue of Love, wrote about both same-sex relationships merely for pleasure as well as deep and meaningful love. Agathon, a famous Greek poet, had a lifelong consensual relationship with a man named Pausanias. I hope that's how you say his name. If not, sorry, man. But there is Parmenides, a Greek philosopher, who had a same-sex partner named Zenon. And although same-sex relationships were much more common in Greek culture, they were not uncommon in Rome. Xenophon's Ephesian tale tells about a young man named Hippothamos, who falls in love with Hyperanthes. There was also examples of same-sex love among women in the time of Paul. There's that of Berenike and Mesopotamia. I'm trying, y'all. Lucia of Samosa mentions the marriage between two wealthy women named Megilla and Demonassa. And archaeological discoveries have shown mutual lasting love between women, including a funeral relief that shows two women holding hands in what resembles a gesture of Roman married couples. N.T. Wright, one of the most foremost scholars on this time period, says this: as a classicist, I have to say that when I read Plato's Symposium, or when I read the accounts from early Roman Empire of the practice of homosexuality, then it seems to me that they knew just as much about it as we do. In particular, a point that is often missed, they knew a great deal about what people would regard as longer-term, reasonably stable relationships between two people of the same gender. This is not a modern invention. It is already there in Plato. The idea that in Paul's day it was a matter of exploitation of younger men by older men or whatever, of course, there was plenty of that then, and there is today. But this is by no means the only thing. They knew about a whole range of options there, and I think we have been conned by Michel Foucault into thinking that this is a new phenomenon. So, although the relationships aren't exactly the same as they are today, Paul and Jesus both had a framework for same-sex, lasting, monogamous relationships. It wasn't brand new to us in our modern age. Now, let's get to the text. First, Romans 1. Therefore, God gave them over to their sinful desires of their hearts, to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lust. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Now, Romans is Paul's theological masterpiece, right? It is his magnum opus, if you will, right? And if we're totally honest, Romans is kind of hard to read, right? And this is in the beginning part of Romans. And so it's important to understand Paul's context. What is Paul talking about here? Paul, for the first 3 chapters of Romans, is basically saying in so many words, we're all hopeless without Jesus. And he's trying to do a machine gun spray of everybody, all y'all, Jews, Gentiles, everybody. We're all damned without Jesus, is essentially what Paul is saying in the first 3 chapters of Romans. So if you're only taking this little part out, you're missing the whole thing. All of us are being identified as Paul as desperately needing for Jesus. That's the context of what Paul is saying here. Now, notice there are 3 exchanges that Paul addresses here, and he's specifically speaking to Gentiles, and he says this: they exchange the Creator for creation, God for self, and natural for unnatural. Now, the progressive pushback on this conversation is that, 1, Paul is not talking about same-sex enduring love. He's talking about excess, uncontrolled lust. And secondarily, they say that he's talking about exploitive relationships, that of abuse of power. Now, from the progressive perspective, Paul is not condemning same-sex relationships, but relationships rooted in abuse of power and the commodification of people in sexuality. So I realize that for a majority of gay people today, they would read this passage and say, that's not me. And I think that that's true in part. However, Paul's not arguing against motive, but rather the action itself. Even though an individual might not identify with all of these behaviors Paul talks about here, Paul is specifically speaking to the root of this, which in Paul's mind is against nature. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the language of mutuality here in this text. So first, Paul considers both people involved to be doing something wrong here, not just one. Again, scholar Preston Sprinkle says, Paul doesn't use the language that suggests exploitive same-sex relations or a power differential. He doesn't refer to rape or pederasty. He doesn't limit his words to men having sex with male prostitutes. This language is all-inclusive and suggests mutuality. He doesn't single out an active partner, nor does his language reflect the typical dominator-dominated paradigm. Surely Paul's words include all of these, and his language is too general to be limited to a particular form of same-sex relations. If Paul wanted to talk about prostitution, or if he wanted to talk about pederasty or these other different views, he had the language to do that. However, Paul chooses the most general language of mutuality on purpose because he's trying to speak to the nature of these relationships. Secondly, Paul never says this has anything to do with excess lust. Some writers believe the reason that someone engaged in these acts are because of uncontrolled lust, but this isn't the only reason why Paul says this is wrong. Paul uses the same arguments for female same-sex acts, and they were rarely, if ever, considered to be a byproduct of excessive lust. Third, there does not answer why the term periphysine was used, which we'll talk about shortly. Paul never says it because of lust, but he says it's because it's against nature. And lastly, Paul's use of the word passions or pathos, the desire itself is not wrong, it's where the desire leaves. Paul never says that desires are excessive. He simply condemns the actions that those desires lead towards. Next, Paul roots his argument in creation here. Now, there are all sorts of really cool allusions that Paul does calling back to Genesis here. Here are just a few. One, Paul refers to God as the creator, immediately drawing your attention back to Genesis chapters 1 through 3. Paul then says that God has been revealing himself since the beginning of what? Creation. Again, drawing yourself to that account. Paul uses gender-specific terms to describe males, arsen, and females, thelu. Those terms were both paired in Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible of Genesis 1:27. So Paul is looking at Genesis 1:27 and taking male and female, those same words, and using them again here in his passage in Romans. Next, Paul uses the same 5 Greek words in Genesis 1:26 in Romans 1:23. The words for image, likeness, mankind, bird, and reptiles. He uses all those same words here in this passage. It is very clear that Paul is writing Romans with an eye on Genesis. Paul is a Jew and deeply rooted in Jewish culture and likely had this memorized, probably both in Hebrew and in Greek. And so this is kind of just flowing out of him in his thing in Romans. Now, lastly, I want to talk about this phrase, against nature. This is the Greek word paraphysein, against nature. Now, the progressive view explains that this phrase is twofold. One, Paul means sex that doesn't lead to procreation. However, this would not only condemn same-sex relationships, but any form of sexual relationship that did not lead in producing children. So, i.e., any birth control or sex acts that do not produce children would be considered wrong here, if that was the way. But Paul discusses marriage and sex quite frequently, and in none of those passages does he ever bring up procreation. He simply talks about the dynamics between a man and a woman in the covenant of marriage. Secondarily, their response is that Paul means against culture, meaning feminizing the passive culture. Again, the low view of women argument. Again, Paul nor the scriptures have a low view of women. In fact, Paul was known for empowering, working alongside, and celebrating women in the church. He calls several women co-workers, workers in the Lord. He commends Phoebe, Junia, and other prophets. Paul teaches men that their bodies are not their own, but they belong to their wives, etc. Paul was incredibly progressive for his time in his empowerment and leading of women. Paul was very pro-women, if you will, and that's the overall theme of the scriptures. So what does this phrase, against nature, mean? Now, I realize that this word can kind of come off wrong, but here's what Paul means, press and sprinkle. Paraphysein is simply stock language used by Roman and Jewish writers to condemn same-sex relations, extramarital or marital, consensual and non-consensual, pederastic, or, as it was used here, the critique in same-sex relationships as alienate the design and nature, or in Paul's view, against the design and intention of the Creator. Romans 1. You still with me? Okay, good. Sorry, it's a lot. You're drinking from a fire hose. Hang in there with me. Now, 1 Corinthians 6, our teaching text. Or do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexual immoral, nor idolaters, nor men who have sex with men, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor slanderers will inherit the kingdom of God. And this is what some of you were, but you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus and by the Spirit of our God. So there's one other passage in 1 Timothy 1 that uses the same exact language here. We're not going to look at 1 Timothy 1. We're going to focus here on our teaching text for sake of time, but it's the same argument here with the language and the verbiage used. So there's 2 words we need to know about. First is malakoi. Can you say malakoi? And the next is arsenokotai. Can you say arsenokotai? Look at you. You guys are going to be ready for lunch, dropping Greek words on everyone left and right. So malakoi simply means soft. So you would say that of like a blanket or something soft that you would touch. It's malakoi, it's soft. This was also like a word used, tongue-in-cheek to refer to a male who was effeminate, right? They would say that they were malakoi or soft. Now the other word, arsenkoitai, literally translates to men who lie with other men. Now I want to acknowledge that this passage has caused so much hurt to the gay community by the way that it was translated. In some of your translations, you may have here, instead of men who have sex with other men, you may have something as generic as homosexuality, or men who participate in homosexuality. And I really wish the translators didn't use that term, because I think it conflates the ideas of orientation and behavior. And I think the NIV gets it right here, where it says men who have sex with men, because it has nothing to do with orientation and everything to do with specifically the action. In these passages, the progressive pushback is essentially this. These words are not used in Greek, so it's impossible to know what they mean. Paul's word, arsenokoitai, he makes up. You can know what he means because he's combining 2 words that are well known, but there's nowhere else that it's used in Greek literature. So some of the progressive pushback is like, there's not other context for us to know what this means, so we have no idea what it means, which, okay, fair pushback. Secondarily, it's that they think that this is speaking specifically to call boys or prostitution because of the words used malakoi and arsenokoitai. Now, those relationships of prostitute and person paying for prostitution absolutely did exist, but I don't think that's what Paul is talking about here. Because Paul creates a word, a really important question is, where did Paul get this word from? Like, did he just like spring it out of his mind? Or is it somewhere deeply rooted in Paul? Remember, Paul's a Jew through and through, so he would have memorized the Old Testament. I want you briefly to look with me at Leviticus as it was translated into Greek. So, meta arsenios oi whatever, koitan gynikos, right? You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. Now look at Leviticus 20:13. No, this is the highlight. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But arsenos koitin, arsenokoitai, arsenios koitin. Can you have any idea where Paul got his word from? All he did was put those together, right? And so if you're reading this in Greek, you realize that Paul's not pulling this word out of nowhere. Being deeply rooted in the scriptures, he takes the word and the language already used in Leviticus 20 and just puts those two words together and invents arsenokoitai. So for the progressive pushback that like, we have no idea what this means, it's like, there you go, right? We don't have to like need a super, you don't need a rocket science degree to realize that's where Paul got his word from, and that's how it's come together. Now, the other pushback to this, right, is the second issue, that Paul's language, nowhere does he use the Greek words for inappropriate relationships. Again, Preston Sprinkles says this. For instance, and I'm not going to read all these Greek words, the Greek word paiderastes was used widely to refer to the love of boys, corrupter of boys, seducer of boys, and so Jewish authors specifically use these latter terms to condemn these practices. Another pair of Greek words, erastus and eronymos, were used to describe the older man and his boy lover. All this to say, Paul had a ton of language to talk about inappropriate relationships, prostitution, men and boys, power dynamics. He had all of those languages, and he chose to use none of them. He chose to use this word. So Paul is not talking about an inappropriate relationship in terms of dynamics here. Now, that's what the scriptures have to say about homosexuality. That's it. So there's not 50 other passages outside of this. This is all that the scriptures speak to this issue. So you can realize how this is contentious. And this leads us all to what I'm so excited to talk about, which is Jesus, right? This is what it all kind of culminates into. So, did Jesus ever specifically address homosexuality? The answer to that question is no, he didn't. He never spoke directly into it. Jesus never spoke about incest either or any other kind of sexual sin. The only category that Jesus uses is that of sexual immorality, which is pretty consistent through and through the scriptures, is anything outside of what Genesis indicates is appropriate for sexual relationships, which is that a man and a woman within the confines of marriage. But Jesus does not speak specific to this issue. Now, the progressive pushback on this is because Jesus said nothing, then we don't know what he means. Maybe. But I think we can infer a lot about what Jesus' sexual ethic would be based on the other things that he has said. So for example, in Jesus' time, one of the most famous passages that we've gone over multiple times in here is Matthew 19, where Jesus is confronted about divorce. And there's a progressive side that's like, dude, get divorced if she burns your toast. You know what I mean? And then there's a conservative side that's like, only if there's infidelity in the marriage. And Jesus says, what God has brought together, let no man separate. Right? That was Jesus' response to this. So Jesus doubles down in marriage and says, we want you to fight for marriage as long as humanly possible. That's like his heart and his desire. And so of the bunch, Jesus is definitely more leaning towards the conservative side of a sexual ethic. That's pretty clear. And Jesus, being a Jew, saying that he came to fulfill the law and the prophets, and he says that not one jot or tittle, no crossing of the I or dotting of the I or crossing of the T, will be done away with, right? That he's come to fulfill those things, has a deep love and appreciation for Leviticus. So I don't think Jesus would be like, that's just the old crusty law. Like, let's talk about love. Like, I don't think that would be Jesus' posture at all. Jesus takes sexual sin pretty seriously, right? In that, in his day, the parameters were just like, hey, don't cheat on your wife. And Jesus is like, dude, if you're lusting after women, you're already cheating on your spouse. Boom, right? And the response is not just like, hey, so don't do that no more. He's like, if your right eye is causing you to sin, rip it out of your head. Right? If there's anything that Jesus is, right, it's pretty stern in his words towards how we are to behave. And Jesus' standards of our ethics are ridiculously high. Don't believe me? Read the Sermon on the Mount. And his call for us as followers of Jesus is high. So if we're to induce anything from all of Jesus' teachings and stuff, it's that he would probably have a more firm understanding of sexuality. Now, he was a Torah-abiding Jew. Jesus obeyed the Torah through and through, Torah being the law, the first 5 books of the Bible, including Leviticus. Preston Sprinkle says this: Jesus on the whole didn't throw away the law. He certainly released us from the law's condemnation and fulfilled the sacrificial system through his death and resurrection, and he corrected Pharisaic misinterpretation of the law, but he didn't walk around scoffing at the Old Testament laws as some dusty relics of his bygone Jewish past. Jesus was a Jew through and through. He loved and cherished the Father's law. So Jesus would have absolutely adhered to the moral law as laid out in Leviticus, which we've discussed about. Now, thinking about all of Jesus' teaching, it's clear that he is pretty strict in his call for human beings. I love what Wesley Hill says, a same-sex attracted Christian, says this: in light of the eschatological arrival of the kingdom of heaven, Jesus appeals over against contemporary experience, i.e. the conversations happening around divorce in his days, and he appeals to Genesis 1 and 2. Intertwining both 127 and 224, he treats the created order as a guide for the moral order. Jesus is so rooted in the scriptures that this is his template for what it means to be human. That's one side of the conversation. Here's the other side. Jesus is known as a friend of sinners. Jesus had radical welcome and radical love. So here's the craziest thing about Jesus. Jesus could preach a sermon like that. Like, if you're lusting after someone, cut off your arm. And then everyone wanted to have dinner with Jesus, right? Now, if any of you are like out there preaching that, I'm not inviting you to lunch. Sorry, but if you're talking about chopping off limbs, dude, I don't think we want to have a turkey sandwich together. You know what I'm saying? But Jesus could, on one end, preach such a powerful and confrontational message. And on the other hand, his slang term for what the Pharisees, the religious leaders, called him was friend of sinners. He was known as a glutton and a drunkard because he ate and drank with people far from God. At one moment, Jesus holds the standard for humanity so high, and in the very same breath, he reaches down with grace to where we actually are. Jesus sets the bar, lives into it, and pulls us up to it. He doesn't speak to us condemned where we are. He brings us into his life. He calls us into his righteousness. He makes us justified. And so, one of the incredible things about Jesus is that he was firm in his convictions, but hear this also, he was generous in his love. Jesus embodied both grace and truth. And this is what John says about Jesus in John 1. He says this: for the law was given through Moses, but hear this, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Jesus welcomed the sinner, but still called for holiness. Both were present at the exact same time. Now notice, Jesus never focused on one group more than the other. He rebuked everyone alike and welcomed all who would come to him. So though Jesus did not speak specifically in this issue, it's safe to us infer that he would align with the rest of the whole of Scripture, that he would not contradict that which has already been written. But he would also display radical love and welcome to anyone with grace. Now to some pastoral questions. First, are people born gay? It's a great question. And I'll defer here to the American Psychological Association, which says, there is no consensus among scientists about the exact reasons that an individual develops a heterosexual, bisexual, gay, or lesbian orientation. Although much research has examined the possible genetic, hormonal, and developmental, social, and cultural influences on sexual orientation, no findings emerge that permit scientists to conclude that sexual orientation is determined by any particular factor or factors. Many think that nature and nurture play both complex roles. Most people experience little or no sense of choice about their sexual orientation. A really long quote of saying, I don't know, right? It's like all the studies that they've ever done, millions and millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of people interviewed. We don't know. So what's the response? What's the response? I don't know. It seems pretty complex. It seems that it's some amalgamation of things that we have nothing to counter for. And I think when we ask this question, it's leading to the wrong place. Do I genuinely believe that most people choose to be gay? No, I don't. I don't think that. For a lot of my gay friends, They expressed to me that this was something that they had that was unwanted initially and learned to kind of accept and live into an identity of that. I want you to imagine putting yourself in somebody's same-sex attracted shoes. Imagine you're 9 or 10, and all of your friends are start talking about the cute boy in science class, right? Or the pretty girl in gym, and there's just nothing for you. You're just like, no thanks, right? And you start to wonder, like, is that ever going to happen for me? And everyone keeps telling you, oh, don't worry, when you get older. And then you're in high school, and it's not changed. And the way that your friends talk about the opposite sex is how you feel about the same sex, right? Imagine being in those type of shoes. The response for us is not, well, were you born that way or not? That's the wrong question. Our only response is immense compassion. Our only response is to love people well, regardless of how they got into the places and shoes that they are. Now, even if someone feels a biological drive within them, does that make it okay? Justin Lee, a same-sex attracted Christian, writes this: just because an attraction or drive is biological doesn't mean it's okay to act on. We all have been born tendencies to sin in a number of ways. If gay people's same-sex attractions were inborn, that wouldn't necessarily mean it was okay to act on them. And if we all agreed that gay sex is sinful, then wouldn't necessarily mean that same-sex attractions aren't inborn. Is it sin, and does it have a biological root, or two completely separate questions? Our response is the same: immense compassion. The next question is, being same-sex attracted sinful? No, it's not. We have all sorts of different temptations and feelings that we have, and simply being attracted to somebody is not sinful. The scriptures say that Jesus was tempted in all ways as we are, yet he did not sin. If attraction or desire is sinful, then that statement's not true, right? But that's not what James teaches us. James teaches us that desire gives birth to sin, but that it's not sin. And so all of us have all sorts of desires bent in us that lead us towards other things. Are those desires sinful? No, that's what's called temptation. Is those desires are exposed and an opportunity presents itself to act on those desires. That's temptation. But to choose to be faithful to Jesus is our response to those things. So in short, no. How does a gay person respond in faithfulness? And this is a great question. So one of the first ways is what's called a mixed orientation marriage. Now I realize this can be seen as controversial, and I see both sides. One, many of you may be familiar with something called reparative therapy. There's a documentary on Netflix called Pray Away. And I think that reparative therapy is probably really stinking awful. And I don't think it's our job as followers of Jesus to try and change people's orientation. Yeah, I just think that that's not helpful or good. And so I sit with that and I understand that, and I realize that there was a lot of damage done to a lot of people as they tried to change their orientation. However, there are examples, and many of them, where people with same-sex attractions marry the opposite sex and have full, fulfilling, beautiful marriages. And they describe their experience as God changing their heart towards specifically their spouse, not necessarily all of the opposite gender, but in particular their spouse. And they're able to have those lives together. Two great stories I'd point to is Jacqueline Hill Perry, who wrote an incredible book called Gay Girl, Good God. So that could have got twisted. Gay Girl, Good God. And then also Breonna Blair, who she's like a pastor preacher in Vancouver, but she has an Instagram called Bun on My Head. So if you're looking further, but she's got some incredible stories about her journey in this. But those are just two off the top of my head. So I could see it both ways. And I'm not here to guide people in any one particularly. Next is the call to celibacy. I realize that might sound really harsh and maybe unkind, but I think that's the wrong view of singleness. 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, I preached a whole hour-long message on the beauty and glory and call to singleness, and I think that we need to change our perspectives on singleness, that it's not a punishment, it's actually a gift to give back to God. And it's a beautiful reality for living in the kingdom. And I think it's our responsibility as the church to allow and create places and spaces where single people can flourish, so it doesn't feel like a punishment, so it doesn't feel like a word of condemnation, but they can have life and life to the full and the beauty and wonder of community, feeling a part of a family here with us. Next, can we disagree and still come to the church? No, I'm just kidding. Of course you can. Sorry, it was too easy. Of course you can. Of course you can disagree with me on this. This is our church's stance on this issue. But man, we would love to wrestle through the hard questions and stuff like that together. If you have pushback for me, if you have questions for me, let's talk. But absolutely, you could belong to this community if you don't believe the same way that I do or that our leadership does about this conversation. Preston Sprinkle says this: until Christians can show compassion and empathy towards LGBTQ plus people, our views will not carry much weight. Our ethics will feel cold and depersonalized, detached from the real lives of people. Compassion without truth is empty sentimentality. Truth without compassion is lifeless and powerless in the age of justice. We need both. The gospel demands both faithful allegiance to God's intention for homosexuality and radical love extended to the marginalized. And lastly, you've made it through, I'm landing this plane, is invitation. Think of Paul's concluding words in 1 Corinthians 6. And that is what some of you were. But you were washed. You were sanctified. You were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God. When we read 1 Corinthians 6 and the list of things that Paul says we will not inherit the kingdom of God, he covers everybody, myself included, yourself included. And our behaviors and our dispositions and our heart postures, all of us are doomed without Jesus. And here's the thing. The call to follow Jesus is not the call to heterosexuality. It's the call to become like him. And God will mold and shape and form all the aspects of your life, including your sexuality. But it's not the main thing. It's not the primary thing that Jesus is after. And too often in the church, we get it backwards. We're like, be straight, then follow Jesus. And there's nowhere in the scriptures that we find that. Jesus calls people as they are, and he says, let's wrestle through life's hard questions together. And each of us here still has junk that Jesus is working on. And so if there was stuff in us that did not align with the ethics of the kingdom, and we would not be allowed in until they did, we would never be allowed in. But it's by God's grace and kindness that he extends towards us, that he invites us to belong to the family and work out the rest. And this is the crux of it all. I realize that this conversation is hard and it's challenging. I may have hurt some of your feelings. You may not agree with me, but I need you to know this, that I love and care about you. And the most important thing about you is not who you're attracted to. The most important thing is who loves you. And it's Jesus. And he set his affections on you, and he's inviting you into new life. And so I don't want this to be the one thing that trips you up or causes you to stumble. But I want you to let it to be invited into Jesus' world, to see the world as he does. And ask the hard questions and wrestle through this all. And lastly, I feel that even in the incredible long sermon I gave, it's inadequate. I couldn't have addressed everything. I couldn't have answered every question. I couldn't have nuanced everything out. But all I want to do is invite you to behold Jesus. And in areas where my words failed and my explanations fell short and I didn't do a good enough job at nuancing out the gray areas, let Jesus be who he is and bring clarity and peace and truth into your life. The Spirit says, or Jesus says of the Spirit, that the Spirit is truth. And the Spirit testifies to Jesus. And the Spirit testifies the truth. And it says in John 16 that the Spirit will guide us into all truth. And so where I may have failed, follow the Spirit into what is true. That's the invitation from Jesus this morning. So let us stand. And we're going to worship. And I just feel that maybe for some of you right now, this has raised a lot of questions. It's brought a lot of different things, and I understand all of that. But right now, I just want to ask you to fix your eyes on Jesus. Just behold him and who he is and what he's like. And start there, and we'll work our way out from there. Brothers and sisters, let us behold Jesus.